We're joined this evening by Fionnan O'Connor to talk about his latest book on all things whiskey. Fionn, thank you so much for joining us this evening. You've written a really engaging book here, and we'll get into it a little bit more, but I'm curious to know, with your eclectic background, how it is you came to write a book about Irish single pot still whiskey.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a long vicarious story, but I was always into whiskey as a hobby for a long time. And then, my background was originally in kind of medieval lit academically, but I was working in whiskey while I was studying. So I was in California, and I was studying with the right hand and working as a brand ambassador for Bushmills with the left, and then started working for a whiskey bar and kind of got further and further into it. And honestly, it just happened by chance. I got very, very lucky. When you're on the flip side of the industry, when you're selling something, you would end up at these kind of whiskey fairs, and you suddenly get access very quickly to everybody else's stuff. And so I was reading a lot about whiskey, but then on a student budget, I just ended up in a position where I could try loads of different things. I got very lucky in terms of who was employing me as well. My old boss, Steve, was very generous about not just giving me stuff, but introducing me to people, and then they would talk to me about stuff. And I started teaching a kind of a local class on whiskey, and when you're up in front of people, you kind of need to review your stuff. So just through a mix of circumstances, and especially in the context I was in, I was working for Diageo, who owned Bushmills at the time, and I would do Bushmills malts, specifically the malt side of Bushmills, and then the Diageo classic malts. I would kind of help out with that. And in that circle, single malt was kind of king. You know, everybody talked about malt scotch, and especially abroad, you know, and people can be very fanatical about single malts as a concept. And Irish pot still was kind of this strange relic, kind of bartender's esoterica, you know, that a few people would know what it was. It was mostly gone, it had disappeared. And when I started the book, it was kind of a last stand. Look, I really want to defend this one thing. And it looked like it was the last of that to be done. And then while I was writing, it took about 3 years. And over the course of just 3 years, suddenly all these distilleries started popping up. Middleton took a renewed interest in single pot still. So it happened by accident, really. The book should have been a third of the size. And then I'm glad I put it out when I did, because if I hadn't, I never would have finished it. You know, now there's like 26 distilleries, I believe, at the moment.
All right. And at the moment, you're doing some research. Can you tell us a little bit about how the book was a launch pad for that research and how that came about?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, when I started writing A Glass Apart, I was going through kind of comp lit, medieval lit, a bit of medieval history, and I was working in archive. I was used to that kind of environment, and I kind of jumped ship into whiskey full time. And when the book came out, there was a lot of research that was left from the making of the book that hadn't gone in, or that hadn't been finished, or that kind of hit a dead end. And I ended up getting a grant from the Irish Research Council to look into the history of Irish whiskey mash bills, essentially grain recipes. And it was this weird, you know, chance at a million opportunity to put the old gloves back on, but as a whiskey critic, as a drinks historian. So again, just a happy accident as much as anything.
And what does the research involve exactly?
So my research is into the mash bills, so the grain recipes of whiskies long ago, as it were. So if whiskey is distilled grain, in the same way that beer is fermented grain, wine is fermented grape, cognac is distilled grapes, you know. But within that, the choice of grain determines the flavor of the spirit. Now, there's distilling plays a part in that as well, obviously, and then casks play a role and so forth. There's many different sides of that flavor composition, but at least the embryo of the whiskey is what grains did you use. And Ireland used to be covered in distilleries, and most of them closed down. And if you ever go to an Irish distillery, they tell you the whole sob story about prohibition and the distilleries closing, but there's not a lot of research into what they were actually doing, what they were making. And so my current research is into looking at the kind of the house styles of the people that closed down and kind of making that available to the new distilleries working today. What were those pre-prohibition liquids?
Sure. Yeah, we'll get into the history in itself, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the industry as it currently stands now. So obviously we're seeing unprecedented growth in the Irish single pot still whiskey industry here in Ireland. What's the driving force behind that growth?
Quality. No, but in all sincerity, there has been an enormous success story. It's been going on for quite a while discreetly. It's only now that there's a whole lot of distilleries that people are suddenly copying on, but the growth has been there for 20 years, really. During the 90s, Irish whiskey started to come back from kind of the graveyard era, and it has grown pretty strongly since. And now it's growing. Not only is it continuing to grow, but it's growing at faster rates than it had been growing before. So it's the fastest growing spirit in the world at the moment. And the rate at which it is growing is continuing to grow. A lot of that's coming from the US, obviously, but also places you wouldn't expect, like South Africa is a big market for Irish whiskey. Russia is a huge expanding market for Irish whiskey. You know, there's places finding Irish whiskey that wouldn't have had it before. So it's exciting times.
And are we keeping up with the demand? Or how are we keeping up with the demand?
Well, this is the problem is with all whiskey, you know, say you have a 7-year-old or a 12-year-old or an 18-year-old product, you need to know 7, 12, 18 years in advance how popular your whiskey is going to be. Because either you lay too much down and you can't sell it, or you don't lay enough down and you don't have it. And both of those are bad ideas. So it's this tricky game. Now, thankfully, Irish whiskey, or Middleton and the established players, expected to grow. So we do have stock, it seems. You know, the new entrants don't have stock of their own. They need to wait for it to age. So a lot of them are buying it from established distilleries, and there isn't enough stock, it seems, to facilitate that kind of element. But it's not like, so say, if you look at Japanese whiskey has exploded. And nobody in Japan knew that they would need as much whiskey as they do, and now there's just no Japanese whiskey. You know, there's a big scramble for Japanese liquid. Irish whiskey doesn't have that problem yet, but you know, if growth keeps going, who knows?
And during the research for your book, you've had the opportunity to kind of travel around Ireland and visit all of these new distilleries that are cropping up all over the place. Is there anything in particular that struck you on your travels?
Yeah, the energy, the confidence more than anything. You know, you have the Irish whiskey landscape has changed dramatically over a very short space of time. I mean, 6 years ago, there were less than 6 distilleries. Now there are 26, I believe, is the current head count. 26 fully complete with at least some liquid laid down. You know, there's more on the way. There's always planning projects, etc. But it's exploded. And I was mostly shocked by people who had no reason to be confident, no seasoning in the hard waters of international whiskey commerce. We're coming and saying, yeah, we're going to make an artisan whiskey. We're going to win all the prizes. We're going to, and that was really great to see, the kind of, not just enthusiasm, but kind of, be bolder still attitude behind the whole thing.
And is there particular challenges that they're all facing, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely. So the biggest one is that distilling is very difficult to get into as opposed to brewing or whiskey distilling, because not only do you have to buy all the gear and make product, but you have to sit on it and you have to age it. So Irish whiskey isn't legally whiskey until it's at least 3 years old. Most of it's over 5 years old. So you're sitting on a lot of product for a very long time, selling nothing, continuing to make whiskey all the time, expecting the payoff, and that's a very steep threshold to kind of enter through. A lot of them are selling gin in the meantime, because gin doesn't have to be aged, so you can sell gin off the still. And thankfully, gin globally has exploded. Not necessarily Irish gin, but just gin as a drink has exploded, and Irish gin is a part of that. And so you look at these Irish gins, Gunpowder, Dingle, Blackwater, Jawbox, they're all tagged to whiskey distilleries who are making gin as a kind of a finance project for the whiskey. And they all got very, very lucky, you know.
Right.
So there's things that have, there's problems, but there's also little advantages that have cropped up accidentally.
And I suppose, like, we've covered quite a bit about the industry itself, and I want to talk a little bit about whiskey itself, I suppose. There's some fascinating, like, information in your book around the provenance of whiskey and the origin of whiskey. And, you know, we hear lots about that the Irish invented whiskey, or that the Scots invented whiskey. But in your book, you say that it's more of a process of evolution rather than creation. What did you mean by that when you said that?
So, I mean, it's odd. You know, what drew me to whiskey history was that, first of all, it's often told in very kind of touristic, very salesman-y type terms, you know, the history of brands or these kind of easy narratives. And if you're looking at whiskey, really, it's agriculture turned to liquor. You're talking about distilled grain. And this is the same stuff we make bread with, the same stuff we feed animals with. It's the history of Irish agriculture kind of through a mirror darkly. You know, anything from like the famine to the corn laws, the growth of wheat, the swing in the type of pasture to tillage landscape we were looking at. This has all affected the history of this drink, and that for me was fascinating, far more fascinating than the kind of sing-along of, you know, this is an ancient Celtic druidic beverage that's been around since the Misty, you know, that's all bullshit.
You could say
that. But the actual history was so much more fascinating and so intriguing. You have this drink that was complex, that was tied to innumerable social ills, that was the misuse of grain for many people, that was also the same drink that has, I mean, it's unique among Irish foods in its adamancy historically that it belongs at the top table. You know, I can't think of another Irish food that has been so confident for so long that it belongs in high dining. And that, for me, that duality, that ambiguity was so rich and so strange. And that drink is not consistent. The great fallacy is to look at whiskey, whether it be Irish or Scotch, whether it be Jameson or Johnny Walker, whether it be Redbreast or Lefroy, and think these are historical ancient products that have been made this way for hundreds of years. No, they haven't. They're the result of an evolutionary chain of varying liquids. And for me, that kind of tie between taste and history, that tie between landscape and liquid was the draw from first principles, you know.
That's right. Also in your book, you discussed this, the marketing myth, or the marketing triumph, let's say, of the triple distilled, or as I like to call it, the smoother taste campaign. Is triple distilled smoother than others?
So, it's an awkward subject. In truth, most of what we're told is triple distilled isn't really triple distilled at all, even in premise. There's two different types of distillation. There's pot distillation or batch distillation, and there's column fractional distillation. And so Jameson, for example, has 3 column stills. It is a 3-still setup, but it's really distilled many, many times internally. It's a different idea. It's not a distillation, whereas a batch is a triple distilled or a double distilled batch. So a lot of this stuff is just marketing hocus pocus from first principles. But when you look at distillation, you're taking, so the whole idea of distillation is that alcohol and water boil at different temperatures. So water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, alcohol just after 78. So if you have a beer that's mildly alcoholic already, and you put it in a still, and you light a fire beneath it that's hot enough to boil alcohol, but not hot enough to boil water, the alcoholic bits of your beer will rise up and the water will stay where it is. Now, this is a very simplified version, but that alcohol vapor will rise up and then it goes over a little U-turn and you cool it on the other side and it condenses into a liquid, but now highly, highly alcoholic. And so you've separated alcohol from beer. Now, what makes pot still distillation so interesting is it's done really badly because the alcohol comes off, but so do all the flavor compounds, the congeners. Now, the better your distillation, the closer you come to distilling pure neutral ethanol, the less it tastes like anything. Right. So really, the more you distill, the closer you're getting to the taste of vodka, which is just shy neutral alcohol. So you could say, yes, when you distill things, you are making a smoother taste, but then you could also say, well, you're also removing flavor compounds, but then you could say, well, we're focusing on certain flavor compounds that can't be tasted, or, so it goes back and forth, but I'd say nobody has a monopoly on bad whiskey. There's bad Irish, there's bad Scotch. You hear all kinds of gibberish about, there's no such thing as bad whiskey, some whiskey is better than others. This is terrible alcohol of all kinds, and I think that's important, because otherwise you're playing into kind of a salesman racket,
Yeah. And one thing you touched on in your book, which I'd like to get your input on, is the question of ice. So ice, yes or no, when taking whiskey? I'll
put it this way, never let anyone, myself included, whatever's written there, tell you how to drink. It's just, you're missing the enjoyment of drinking from first principles when you start taking instructions about, how you ought to be doing it. Whiskey and ice, if you're on a beach somewhere far from where we are, and it's a hot summer day, it can be a very refreshing experience. People enjoy it. People should do it.
Does it do anything to the flavor?
If you are drinking for analysis, keep ice as far away as possible. When you chill something, you anesthetize aroma in general. That's why food out of the freezer doesn't smell. You have, there's a weird topic called phantom bitterness that often comes up, which is where if you take beer that doesn't taste like anything, you take Coors or some horrible, flavorless product, and you stick it in the fridge, not only does it become cold, but it contracts your tongue a bit. You get this weird, almost kind of like a beer taste, and that's used to disguise flavor, but it's also used to kind of simulate something like a flavor. So chilling has become a huge part of drinks culture, but no, I don't think if you're drinking for analysis, you should just leave it something between room temperature and the temperature of your own hand.
Okay, that's great. A significant portion of your book is historical in nature. And I was struck when I was reading it about a particular event that occurred in 1875, I believe. And it was something that I wasn't aware of, and I don't think a lot of people are aware of, but it came to be known as the Great Whisky Fire of Dublin. Can you tell us a little bit about that? That event?
So, it's funny, when I was doing the research for the book, I ended up with this kind of map I was drawing at. I found an old 1870s map of Dublin, and I took a big highlighter and started trying to mark out where bonded warehouses and distilleries and so forth were, because that whole landscape is not quite lost. Dublin used to be covered in distilleries. Not even that there were that many, they were just really, really big. And so we had, the NCAD was the old Powers distillery, but then you had George Row, which ran right from Thomas Street to the Liffey. Huge amounts of space, and then bonded warehousing, casks laid down all over the place. And so the Liberties district would have been kind of ground zero of Irish whiskey. You would have had 3 out of the 4 big Dublin distilleries were in and around the Liberties. And a lot of the warehousing was there too. And so the Great Whisky Fire was the biggest fire in the history of Victorian Dublin, in terms of loss of property, in terms of loss of life. And it started at Malone's bonded warehouse, and it kind of spread down Cork Street, RD Street. Alcohol, of course, cask strength alcohol is highly flammable. So it just spread from site to site, expanding at a rate that was uncontrollable. And early days of the Dublin Fire Brigade, the whole idea of there being a civic fire brigade. And there was a chief, a fellow named James Robert Ingram, who had done his training over in New York as a kind of New York firefighter and come back and kind of spearheaded the Dublin Fire Brigade. And at that time, Dublin was a city of horse-drawn cabbies. So they couldn't water the stuff out because it was just mixing and spreading faster and so forth. It was uncontrollable. And he came up with the idea of bringing all the horse dung from the day's cabbies, which usually sent off to silos, bringing it to the Liberties and building these kind of barricades of horse manure to stifle out the whiskey so it wouldn't get further. And a lot of the newspapers from the time talk about, these ridiculous pictures of people with their boots off drinking whiskey out of the gutters. And 13 people died, seemingly from alcohol poisoning. Of course, there is bias from the newspapers. A lot of these were... The British press at the time didn't have the most balanced view of the Irish working class, so we're getting it through a kind of a mirror darkly of, again, pictures of people with their boots off, getting skull out of their brains in mixes of horseshit and whiskey. But even so, yeah, just a particularly bizarre portrait of the distilling industry at its peak.
And I'm interested to know, like, obviously you write quite a few articles, let's say, and you appear on some podcasts. If I was a whiskey enthusiast, where would I go to find more information about Irish whiskey?
Well, there's a lot out there now, and that's, again, all of that's very new too. And one thing that led me to writing the book was, and this wasn't that long ago, this was like 2012 when I first started thinking about writing the book. Came out in 2015, and a lot had changed by then, and now a lot's changed even more so, and quicker and faster. But when I first started, there was one website called Liquid Irish, and it was an Irish whiskey / other Irish drinks blog. And now that's actually gone quiet, and at the same time, there's loads of blogs. Twitter has become a phenomenon. I mean, it was there in 2012, but it's really become a blogger's phenomenon now. The big ones I would point to in Ireland would definitely be, so there's potstilled.com, which is a fellow named Matty Healy, and he does interviews, it's a podcast. And there's Irish Whiskey Magazine, which does articles. And both of those have been fantastic kind of resources. And then there's wider whiskey resources. There's Whiskey Cast, that's a big one internationally for podcasts. And then there's Whiskey Magazine, there's Whiskey Advocate. There's a lot of existing kind of whiskey geekdom, and Ireland is kind of stepping boldly into that.
Brilliant, great stuff. And where can people get your book?
They can get it on Amazon. They can get it in any respectable Dublin bookstore will carry it. It's fairly readily purchasable. A few bars, I know the Dingle Whiskey Bar carry it. But yeah, Amazon is, like That's many great. Books, the easiest way to get it.
Okay. Listen, thank you so much for your time, Fionnan. That's about all the time we have. So yeah, that's brilliant stuff. Thank you so much.
Grand.
Cheers.
Thank you very much.